The topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
Hello and welcome to the new episode of Mindfulness in Action. My name is Dalida Turkovic, and today we will be talking about perhaps treasures as well as challenges of neurodiverse couples. Well, my dear guest is Grace Myhill, and I met Grace a couple of years ago as I attended a program that she led. And it was so inspiring. I learned so much from her. The one way I could describe Grace is someone who knows what is the right thing to say in a space where two people are really struggling to find their common language. And this deep listening for Grace started when she was an intern, and she began to interview people who were on the spectrum at that time. She approached the organization, and the language was still around Asperger's syndrome and so on. So much has changed since then, but let me bring Grace into studio so she can tell you a little bit about that, and we can dive into the conversation on how can neurodiverse couples really make it happen in their relationship. So, Grace, welcome.
Thank you, Dalida. I'm glad to be here.
Yes, it's so wonderful. I know that you're also at the place where you are transitioning from your long career, I would assume, with AANE. Can you tell us a little bit about that? You had that first interview, and then you just approached and said, look, I listened to these people. And
well, I was an intern at social work school, and I was in a counseling center at a college, and there was this one young woman who perplexed me and my supervisors. And I knew that there was someone in my neighborhood who had a daughter on the spectrum. And so I asked her, what do you think about this client? Do you think she could have been on the spectrum? It was already too late to help that one woman because she had graduated and moved on. But my next job was actually at another college counseling center. So I wanted to know, okay, what do I need to know if I'm going to work with people on the spectrum? So this neighbor of mine, this friend of mine, she was leading a group of adults at AANE, which at the time was called the Asperger's Association of New England. And she invited me to come in and listen to her group attendance to hear directly from the source what their experiences were at college and what they wished a counselor would have known to help them. So it was a wonderful experience. I learned a lot. The group kept inviting me back to tell me more and more and more. They wanted to share their experiences. And my friend, who became my colleague then, liked having another social worker in the room. So she asked me to co-lead the next group with her for adults on the spectrum. Well, this was back, maybe 25 years ago. And partners of adults on the spectrum were calling AANE, and they were asking for support for themselves. So the organization said, hey, Grace, can you lead partners groups? I said, sure. I was still learning. I was, enjoying the experience. And then the partners were asking, could we bring in our spouses? And so then I started doing couples groups. So this went on, and I, just learned so much from jumping in and working with the clients themselves. And then when I became a licensed social worker and I had my private practice, I expected to get all kinds of different clients, but 99% of my clients came from referrals from AANE because they finally had someone who understood what it looked like in adults. There were so many people at the time who were working with children on the spectrum, and it wasn't really a shared common concept that these children grow up, and they grow up into adults on the spectrum with, similar challenges, but just in different contexts. So that's really how it all began.
Absolutely amazing. I remember when we were connecting at the beginning, and when I was attending your program, and I asked a question, because there were many therapists also having clients, and you made the comment and you said, well, I know it's challenging, but I know those people who come at the right time have great results, and those people who connect with me actually manage to stay in the relationship. But actually, a lot of these relationships don't really manage to survive. And sadly, so what does it mean to come on time and connect counselor?
Yeah. I think that if a couple comes to you and they're both able to be open to changing behaviors, then that makes it a right time. A lot of times people focus on feeling like their partner is trying to change them or who they are. And that's not what this work is about at all. It's about understanding who each other are and accepting that there are these intrinsic neurological differences. But it's just really about some behaviors that are not comfortable for one partner or the other, and really being open to doing something different. The couples that come in where one person is being dragged in, or there's just so much defensiveness, that's not a good time. You really need to wait until both people are ready to do some listening, I think.
Right. And what could be, I mean, it's so neurotypical of me to say, what could be typical challenges, right? But let's say there are something across the everybody's experience. So there are challenges on both sides. So what could be some challenges that divergent or neurodivergent person on the spectrum would have with a neurotypical person? We often go from the other end, right? And say,
right.
well, we neurotypical people, and it's like, okay, enough of that.
Right.
So what could, if someone who is on the spectrum could bring their partner in and say, I need you to listen to me, what could they be asking for?
A lot of it has to do with timing. There are timing differences, and that not just means processing information, but timing in terms of transitions and when you are ready for something. And so it might be just a simple ask of, can my neurotypical partner please ask first, is this a good time to talk? Before just jumping in and assuming that the partner on the spectrum can instantly shift their focus and engage in the way that the other partner wants them to, and then get back to what they were doing beforehand. So timing, I think, is one big request, that there be awareness of these timing differences, but also the expression of emotions is really, really challenging. So with any couple, there are going to be disconnections. There are going to be situations. There are going to be situations where one partner accidentally hurt the other person's feelings. It's not intentional, but it happens. And for a lot of partners who are on the spectrum, they don't necessarily know that they've hurt their partner's feeling, but then they get hit with, it almost feels physical. It's not, but it almost feels that way, with this rush of emotional outburst. And that's very hard on their sensory systems. It's very confusing. It can cause them to panic. It can cause them to really shut down. And it doesn't lead to a very good reconnection experience. So I think, if a partner in the spectrum could ask their partner to come to them in a kind way, in a gentle way. Some people will say with a slow startup, let them know what's going on. Maybe even in writing, it's better than being face to face with the person. But to give them a chance to explain, they also want to be heard. They want to be understood, and they do have a reason for what they did. So a lot of times when, therapists are working with couples or coaches are working with couples to help them learn to apologize, it doesn't go very well if they don't know about the neurological differences, because for people on the spectrum, saying you're sorry can feel like an admission of being wrong. And that's not how they feel. They don't feel like they did anything wrong. They feel like they had good intentions, but they're not being given a chance to explain that a lot. So, my approach is always to help both partners come to be curious and learn more about what makes each other comfortable and uncomfortable, and then figure out ways to communicate about that, and to then, come up with what I call win-win solutions. Once you understand what caused the hurt, but what wasn't understood about the behavior and what the intentions were, then both people can usually figure out a different approach. And that's something that will help them prevent the same hurts in the future.
So maybe this is often in these, there are a lot of conversations going on about neurodivergent and neurodiverse and the difference, and a lot of these conversations start with actually making that difference. So could you share with us what does briefly, how could one person make a difference in being, for example, cross-cultural couples? There's a lot of neurodiversity there, right?
Right.
But it's not the same as neurodiverse couples when there is one person on the spectrum and another one not. Could you share a bit?
Right. Well, the reason why there are often more almost successful communication with neurodiverse couples that are also cross-cultural is because they don't make assumptions of the same understanding because of the cultural differences, and also maybe language differences, or even just upbringing differences, geographic differences. If you're already tuned to differences that are neither better or worse, and you take the time to understand and to ask, you have to ask more questions. Like, does this mean this? Or what did you mean by this? Or I'm not so familiar with that. Can you help me understand? That kind of approach is what neurodiverse couples in general need. But I think the problem sometimes is when a couple isn't from different cultures, they assume that, whatever is said means what they think it means. And that's the tricky part, because it often doesn't. It means something different to each person, whether it's a literal interpretation or whether it's just an unfamiliar idiom, or just something someone's not familiar with, or something someone's uncomfortable with. So even what I said earlier, like the idea of apologizing, saying you're sorry, saying I'm sorry means very different things to different people. Some people overuse it. And if you just say, I'm sorry all the time, it becomes meaningless. A lot of times people will say, well, what are you sorry for? And the other person may say, I'm sorry I made you upset. But they have no idea still what they did or how not to do it. But if you take the time to ask those questions that you have to, what would make you feel better? What did I do that made you feel uncomfortable? How can we change this in the future? So I think that's, really key, being able to be curious. And so if you're used to being curious anyway, because of other differences, it's going to extend very well to the neurodiverse couples.
So this is the point when mindfulness comes in a little bit, and having the awareness that something is not quite clicking, right? And I mean, I know that when, as a teacher of mindfulness and the coach, I know that when people don't know the practice, it's really hard to bring them into that space of awareness, of seeing the other, and then on top of it also having awareness of own needs or what's not really gelling. And then it's coming a bit into complexity, into coupleship, right? That in itself, there's so many potentials for conflict anyway, right? So how do you bring that desire for the awareness, and when it comes into the couple, really knowing what to observe and how to bring that curiosity?
I think it has to start with a feeling that you're on the same team with your partner and that you're both there ultimately to support and care about each other. And even just showing support and caring can be very different for each partner in a neurodiverse relationship. And that has to be sort of unpacked and understood, how each partner wants to feel cared about and wants to feel supported. That might look very different for what the other partner wants. And therefore, often people give what they want themselves, as opposed to thinking, oh, wait, just because I want this doesn't mean my partner wants this. I have to ask and find out. But if you are in a relationship where it's based on the foundation that you are on the same team with each other, then when you have those conflicts, they don't escalate as much because you don't have to defend yourself as much because you still feel cared about. If you stop feeling cared about, it becomes a much more difficult bridge to get. I mean, gap to bridge, sorry, a difficult gap to bridge. Yeah, so it really is about, really trusting that your partner does care about you. And then you have to have ways that you feel that in your everyday life. It can't just be once in a while on your wedding day, it's never said again. It really has to be reinforced pretty consistently throughout the relationship that both people do feel cared about. And the other thing, in terms of like mindfulness, being aware that things are escalating is really key. And then the next step is usually a pause of some kind, because you want to stop the escalation. And again, like I said earlier, the timing of things is really important. When things start to get tense, they can appear to go much faster, right? All of a sudden, everybody's escalating and voices are getting louder and speech is getting faster. And processing is actually getting slower because anxiety is increasing. And as anxiety increases, processing time is required to absorb all that's going on. So a pause is a really good thing. So each person can get centered and remember that the other person cares about them, and then go back to the conversation. It's, a lot of couples issues, it's not really about the thing that led to the argument. It's ultimately about the feelings underneath, which is often something someone is doing that makes the other person feel criticized or uncared for or not accepted or judged in some way.
Right. And, if we were to skip the description of this podcast episode and your background, you could still be talking about any couple, right? These are really, so these topics are really alive everywhere. There are nuances and something that I'm refreshing my memory on what you taught me. So cared for. So how do we care for differently? Could you share that?
Sure. And I like the way you started with the perspective or needs of the partner on the spectrum. A partner on the spectrum often needs to feel that they can take breaks when they want to, that they can have the downtime that they need to recharge, that they're not being micromanaged, that they have their autonomy respected, that they're treated like an adult, and that they're treated like a person who has good ideas too. Because sometimes when a diagnosis is present, sometimes people tend to feel damaged or broken in some way, and they feel bad about themselves, and they might have very active shame triggers. So they need to feel that it's comfortable in their relationship for them to express what they need, even if to their partner it makes no sense. Like social battery as a concept, right? It exhausts many people on the spectrum to be social for extended periods of time without a break. But even being in the presence of one other person, it doesn't need to be a room full of 60 people. It could just be one other person, and it could still be exhausting. And so just being allowed to have that freedom to feel like you could say what you need and not be interrogated about it or, uh, judged for it. Now, the reason why I use the word interrogated is because oftentimes the other partner doesn't understand, and their mode is to ask questions if they don't understand. But asking a question in a way that is too open-ended may make it hard for the other person to answer. Like, what are you feeling? That may be too hard a question. Or what do you need? That might be too hard a question. And that could be hard for anybody to answer. So, but what happens then is without the answers, the other person just starts to ask more and more questions. Or if there's one word answers or very short answers, they ask more and more questions and they're trying to pull out information. They're trying to understand, but the dynamic doesn't feel good. So it becomes very lopsided. And so I think for the partner on the spectrum, they need space, they need time, and they need the comfort to be able to ask for those things. On the other side, what the person not on the spectrum tends to need to feel cared about is reassurances that are either verbal or physical, even that the other person cares about them. So just affection, whether it's verbal or physical. Compliments are reassuring. People on the spectrum don't tend to do that kind of communication. And they don't often initiate just reassurances, and they don't often understand that they're even required because they don't necessarily require them themselves. So it's not even knowing what they don't even know. So I think, both people need very different things to feel cared about often, or they might need the same thing, but it looks very different. Right? They both might need to feel safe and comfortable and accepted and not judged and not criticized, but it plays out very differently in everyone's head.
Right, absolutely, and also that whole element of time as well, spending time alone to recharge, and the personal space that needs to happen can often be misinterpreted as well, right? Like, especially if the person that is not on the spectrum is really wanting quality time all the time.
Yes, absolutely. So it can feel quite rejecting. A typical example can be a couple goes out to dinner and the one partner might think they're on a date, right? The other partner might think they're just having a meal out. So even expectations for what's going on is helpful to get on the same page. But let's say, they don't both acknowledge it's a date and it's at a restaurant that has a lot of background noise and it has a lot of busyness and sensory experiences. And so then they come home from the date and the non-spectrum partner might want to continue the feeling of connection. And they could be thinking, well, we had a date. Now we're going to be emotionally connected. Now we're going to be physically connected. Meanwhile, the other partner might need to just come in and take a break and just go off alone. Might not even have enough capacity to express what's going on, but they just might walk away and go take time to themselves. And that can feel very rejecting. So without the understanding of what each other's needs are, it gets very confusing.
And especially if there's not understanding, or again trying to ask questions, and the loop just goes on and on and on. So this can be very helpful for people to have understanding of these triggers, and how important is for a partner to be diagnosed.
So
Is it
that's
necessary?
so there's self-diagnosis, there's formal diagnosis, and then there's something that I call spouse diagnosis, because oftentimes it is only the intimate partner who sees a lot of the traits in the person. And so it can be important if the couple is trying to understand fully what's going on. It doesn't have to be a formal diagnosis, but if both people can get on board with the fact that their conflicts might be arising from neurological differences, like the acceptance of that premise can be very important. If one person is just in denial about their differences, then there can't be a lot of progress made. They're not going to want to do those behavioral changes I brought up earlier. They're just going to want to keep doing what they're doing and just be accepted for who they are and what they do. And that's hard. So I think sometimes accepting the idea of the neurological differences is the important part. And that gives them a pathway. That gives them a pathway forward. Because you brought up a point earlier that some of the things I was describing would be helpful for any couples. But the opposite isn't true. When other couples are in therapy with or coaching with, with people professionals who don't understand neurodiversity, they're given certain tools that may help them. But when a neurodiverse couple is in therapy or coaching with a professional who doesn't understand the neurology, those same tools don't often help and can make things worse. And one person can feel blamed or shamed or misunderstood in the therapy, and it could be a difficult experience. So I think, if they do understand, if a couple accepts that there are these neurological differences in their approaches to life, in their perceptions, their communication, their experiences, even their sensory experiences in the world, then they have resources available to them. They could find a therapist or a coach who understands, who can help them interpret for each other, and then can help teach them how to interpret for themselves, but and give them tools and strategies that do work for them. And so without that awareness that this is who they are and what's going on in their relationship, they're not going to they may not find the appropriate resources to help them.
Absolutely. And I remember there was one point that really got me thinking when you shared during the program, the course, that sometimes non-trained professional who is using a traditional approach, not necessarily traditional, just not being neurodivergent trained, would bring the elements of codependence, for example, or even that would be put on the neurotypical partner. And because neurotypical partner would really show a lot of not understanding or asking for too much and so on. So could you share a bit on how does that come into the play, that from one professional it's suddenly, oh look, these are the tools, and another one would just go and label it completely differently?
Yeah, these are good questions you're asking. So most of the time, and I'm talking in generalities, but there's always differences with individuals. If a non-spectrum partner wants to feel connection, it usually is some sort of verbal talking about feelings, let's say. Being able to share their feelings, being able to ask how their partner's feeling. That's how they feel close. But those are very uncomfortable areas usually for a person on the spectrum. They don't necessarily know their feelings. They don't necessarily know how to help their partner, or even that they're supposed to listen to their partner's feelings. They may be great at problem solving. They may jump in to problem solve, which actually can make a lot of non-spectrum partners feel worse because they're being told what to do. They're not being heard or listened to. So they, they start to feel less and less cared about the more they're asking for what they need. And so it can look like the non-spectrum partner has all the problems and the issues. They're too needy, they're too emotional, they're dysregulated, they're insecure, or the codependent word that you brought up, it can look like they're only concerned making things peaceful, and they're willing to sacrifice their own happiness to make sure their partner's okay. And it's labeled as something pathological, as being codependent. But what really might be happening is they're trying to prevent their partner from being uncomfortable, because there can be very uncomfortable outcomes if a partner on the spectrum gets dysregulated themselves because they didn't have the time and space to regulate themselves. It can look like something very scary, just the shouting or moving one's body, or not being aware of what one's doing in physical space. I often hear from people where they may say, you were looming over me and talking in a very, rigid, unfriendly tone. And those are things that anyone can do. But if someone is trying to share their feelings and the response is something so negative, then they do start to walk on eggshells, and they do think, well, I don't want to be subject to this discomfort in the relationship, so I'm going to do what I can to make sure that my partner's comfortable. And they start overcompensating, and it has a toll. It takes a toll on their own nervous system. They get hypervigilant. They get very very stressed, and at the slightest expression, whether it's nonverbal or verbal, they start to worry, oh no, this is something's coming down the pike, and they assume the worst. Meanwhile, that nonverbal expression might not mean what they think it means at all. The other person may be just doing something in their own body. An example of this is like if someone on the spectrum is seated and relaxing, and their partner says, oh, can you go get the door? Someone's at the door. Can you go answer the door? Or, oh, could you go take the dog out or something? Oftentimes the response is going to be a big sigh and like this big kind of nonverbal expression that the partner interprets as, oh, I shouldn't have asked. They don't really want to do the thing I just asked. When really it's just about transitioning from being in a restful, seated position, and now the person on the spectrum has to transition their body to stand up, to go into action. They have to reposition their brain to stop thinking about whatever they were thinking about and focus on some task. And so there's a lot of room for miscommunication, misunderstanding, and misassumptions. But it can look like, back to your point, that in a therapist's office, it could look like the partner not on the spectrum is being unreasonable, they're being needy, they're trying to micromanage how their partner looks and the facial expressions they make. And, rolling of eyes is another one that gets talked about a lot. It means very different things. It usually means for the person on the spectrum that they're frustrated and they're working something out in their own head. And to the non-spectrum partner, it looks like disrespect. So it triggers a lot of emotion. So, it's tricky. And also normally in front of a third party, in front of a professional, where the partner on the spectrum is prepared for the session, they can look very calm and rational. right? And very gentle. And so they present differently than maybe what's happening at home. But in that space where the non-spectrum partner thinks they finally have somebody, a professional, who's going to understand them, and they're so relieved to be able to get out all their feelings, they can look almost hysterical, or very, very emotional. So then it looks like an imbalanced relationship where it's the non-spectrum partner that is needing the work to learn how to calm down and be more gentle too. And so that distortion can be very damaging to the relationship too, because now the non-spectrum partner is being pathologized for things that it's coming from a different place. The behaviors might look the same, but it's for different reasons. And so the way to help it are going to be different if the source is different.
Right. That can be so frustrating, actually. On not really, I can just imagine that moment of coming to the therapist and saying, well, when I say go and get a door please, and he or she sighs, it's so frustrating. And suddenly, like, what are you, I mean, what, the person just sighed and there you are making a big deal, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But in reality is something that happens over and over again, and it's a pattern and communicating completely different message. And so after the couple understands these things, for example, well, when I sigh, so does it come like that, or does the therapist actually interpret the behavior? How does it usually happen in a session?
Yeah, usually the professional is who understands the differences of the neurologies can explain both sides and check out with the people, obviously, that they're getting it right. But then as the non-spectrum partner does start to understand that these things mean something different, it's not like they could turn off their automatic reflex. They will always feel like an eye roll feels disrespectful initially, but it's what you do next. It's like if you feel it, but you can say, hey, you just rolled your eyes, didn't feel so great to me. What's going on for you? And the other person, meanwhile, the person on the spectrum can acknowledge, oh, even though it's not meant to be hurtful, it is hurtful. And they learn that, they could say, oh, sorry, I'm just so frustrated with myself that, I can't get out my words in a way that I'm thinking about them, so they can share more. It's also interesting that a lot of times the response of the person on the spectrum when there's a conflict is to say less. They think that it's what they said that caused the situation to get worse. So their tendency is, I just won't say anything. And then it turns into, I won't even spend time in the same space as my partner, because when I do, these conflicts arise. But what really is required for working through things and getting to a better place is more communication, not less, and is being around each other more, but in a way that feels good. There's this whole, it's okay if I bring up a whole new topic of masking.
Mm-hmm, absolutely. Yes, please. Mm-hmm.
So there's a concept that, people on the spectrum mask. They pretend, they act in a way that takes a lot of energy to hide something, to hide their difference, or to hide what their true words, they wish what, their unfiltered thoughts. They're working so hard to make sure that they don't do or say anything that's going to raise any flags for anybody. But when they are home in their own safe sanctuary where they want peace and relaxation, they want to unmask. Now, for a lot of people, that can mean they want to just be however they would be when they're completely alone. They don't want to spend energy on that. They just want to be. But what I tell couples is, you're in an intimate relationship. That is a social relationship. And you have to bring some social skills every time you interact with your partner. You can't just say whatever you want to say in an unfiltered way and act the way you want to act without any concern for how it's going to impact another person. So there has to be time when you can decompress and rest up and generate enough energy to bring some social awareness and consciousness of how your actions impact somebody when you're in the presence of your partner. And I don't think that's an obvious paradigm for people on the spectrum. I think it is for non-spectrum folks. They know when they're around another person, even their partner, they're going to act a certain way, and their neurology tends to be almost an automatic thought of, how are my actions going to impact another person? If I said this, how would it be received? But this is that theory of mind stuff that is often challenging for partners on the spectrum. So they have to learn, okay, when I'm around my partner, I do have to think about whether I'm going to do or say something that's going to make them uncomfortable or comfortable. And raising that awareness, it takes work, but the more people practice these things, the easier it gets. And they become very fluent in the fact that none of this is personal, right? Once you're aware of the neurodiversity in the relationship, it does help to say, okay, this is not personal. My partner does actually still care about me, but they're just behaving in a way that's not quite where I want it to be at this point.
Mm. Thank you for bringing the masking. And also there's this whole topic about women, and they mask even more skillfully, and looking at the time, this is the moment when it comes like, oh, here is this whole other topic, and we're almost running out of time. But it's not the purpose of us talking to reveal everything, but to touch on certain topics so people can begin to explore more, because there is a lot to explore. What I would like to just briefly, if we can manage on, if we had for the person who is not on the spectrum, being sometimes often labeled as codependent, submissive, or too motherly, perhaps, if it's a woman, someone who is willing to compromise a lot just to subdue these behaviors of explosion and so on. On the other side, there's a label of people on this partner that is on the spectrum that is also really not doing them fair. And you mentioned this kind-heartedness, and that label is narcissism, right? So that also can appear, and often to the partner who is not on the spectrum, when they begin to question certain behaviors, it's easy to self-diagnose that the partner is actually having narcissistic behaviors. How do we make the difference?
So there are some therapists out there who focus on that distinction. What is narcissism versus autism? There is some overlap, so it does make it difficult. Autism means about the self, and so people on the spectrum often are very self-focused and self-involved, but it's for a different reason. What they're doing is often trying to understand how the world works. They're trying to solve problems. They're thinking all the time. They can't shut off their brain. It goes where it goes. It takes them a while to get up to speed in thinking, and they want to stay in their lane and hyper focus on something and really think it through very deeply. So they do things that look like they're not interested in connection with their partner. They spend time alone. They are quieter. They're to themselves, or they have lots of passions and they spend time on those instead of spending time engaging and connecting. I'm not an expert in narcissism at all, but I do think that the intentions behind the behaviors are different. So, for example, an autistic person may say something in an unfiltered way, and it might be insulting to their partner. I think a narcissistic person would know what they're doing and would intentionally be manipulating a situation and be putting someone down in order to raise their feelings of themselves, to inflate their own feelings of themselves as being better. I think that people on the spectrum, they may be better at understanding a particular concept that they are interested in. You know, they can be excellent at their professions, excellent at explaining things that they're very knowledgeable in, but they're not. So they may be the smartest in that way, or their IQ may be very high, but they're not trying to put people down and make people feel stupid. In fact, most people on the spectrum would be mortified if they heard that they made someone feel stupid. That's not at all what they're trying to do. They're trying to share their knowledge and experience and help the other person be a better version of them. So I do think that most of the couples I work with, the partners on the spectrum, are very well intentioned. And it's really just not knowing the skills and the tools and the manners and the behaviors, whatever you want to call it, that would make their partner feel differently towards them. So, so instead, partners don't know what's going on, and they're trying to figure it out. And enough of the traits might look similar to narcissism. So they end up using that as a reason. But, that's damaging as well.
Yes, yes. And for the end, if there could be your personal wish for all those couples there who might be aware, not aware, whoever is listening, but when it comes to the time, because it seems that there are a lot of challenges, even when the environment is standing still and everything is perfect and people have steady jobs and working environment is great and families are supportive, couples are still going to be having a lot of challenges. But in reality, there are a lot of challenges that couples go through, because that's just life. So when the environment changes where the couple is, what could be some of the most important things to pay attention to, if there is such a thing?
Right. I think paying attention to having both partners still feel connected to each other, whatever that means, and coming back to the idea that you're on the same team, and then trying to figure out what each person needs to be comfortable, and make it clear that you're curious about what each other need to be comfortable and need in general, and then to communicate that with each other. So that's what leads to connection. That's what I see as the foundation, these 4 C's of comfort, curiosity, communication, and connection. And if you can stay focused on that, then the other examples of life can be sorted out. But I think this is the basis where you're, where you need to really figure out ways of doing those things.
Yeah. Grace, thank you so much for your passion, knowledge, your experience above all, and for those who would like to connect with you, what are your next steps?
Sure. Thank you. You can visit my website, which is just gracemyhill.com. And I have online groups for either partner separately or for couples together. And I do coaching with couples. And, if you want to email me, you could email me at gmyhill@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me through my website.
Thank you so much for all the work that you're doing. And for now, this is it. This is Mindfulness in Action. My name is Dalida Turkovic, and see you next time.